back to your first time sitting behind that wheel, way up high looking down on the world. Can't nothing beat that feel. Maybe you're brand new, your daddy taught you. Maybe your mom shifts them gears. No matter what got you on this ride, but damn sure glad you're here. We love this big truck life. Got the windows down, tanks filled up, passing miles trying to make a buck, yeah. We love this big truck life, but it ain't for everyone. It takes a special kind. Nothing like the open road to put your mind at ease. Hammer down in the fast lane, black smoke in the breeze. Oh, you sacrifice for everyone. At times it goes unseen. Regulations killing us. Guess where you can shop that ELD? We love this big truck life. Got the windows down, tanks filled up, passing miles trying to make a buck, yeah. We love this big truck life, but it ain't for everyone. It takes a special kind. We love this big truck life. Got the windows down, tanks filled up, passing miles trying to make a buck, yeah. We love this big truck life, but it ain't for everyone. It takes a special kind.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of Freight Broker Live. This is the recurrence of my wildly popular show from a couple of years ago, but now that I'm back in the freight game 24/7, I decided to revamp this show so we could provide some sort of education for those that are truly working in the industry and are scratching their head saying, what the heck is going on? Because I'll be honest, the first couple of days back in the industry, I did the same thing. I scratched my head going, wait, whoa, what's going on? Like, what's with these rates? What's with this? What's with that? Because it's quite a bit different. Even you take 2 years off, and it's quite a bit different. Let's start off with the biggest difference that I found is, for a long time, you know, they were doing it in 2019, in 2020. If you watch some of my videos on YouTube from back then, I was complaining or talking about freight rates from the broker perspective and saying, you know, it's crazy so many carriers believe that freight brokers are price gouging, that they don't understand the, very, fundamental economics concept of supply and demand, right? Because that's what I thought that was playing the biggest role. After calling on so many loads yesterday, I must have called well over 100 loads yesterday. I'm not quite certain that I even believe that anymore, to be honest. Because now I'm on the carrier side. Granted, I was then too. I was dispatching and stuff. But now I'm on the carrier side. And I'm calling on loads that simply, when they give me the rate, it doesn't make any sense. Like, from a broker perspective, I don't know why anyone would ever quote their customer so low. But they are, apparently. Which is absolutely crazy. And it does lead you to believe either, one, the broker is just being, greedy and taking a profit and selling a load to a carrier for, quite a bit less than what they should. And we're talking like 40, 50, 60, 70% under the spot. There was one load I called on yesterday that was going 1,928 miles, had 2 stops, and it was paying $1,800 for a full truckload, 44,000 pounds. And even if you're trying to do it as a backhaul, that's a horrible rate. Like, I could understand like a $1.20, $1.30, $1.40 because that's what the lane was dictating via the spot market. But I can't imagine selling a load for under $1 a mile. It just doesn't make any sense. And from the broker's perspective, if I was going to go out to customers and try to get that business, I just couldn't find, I don't think I could bid, on the concept that a broker's only making, 10, 15, 20% profit margins. I don't know if I could go out and actually quote a customer and say, hey, listen, you have this lane. I want to move this lane, but I'm going to charge you, 10% over spot market or the whole thing just doesn't make a lot of sense to me that rates are as low as they are. Okay. Like, rates are pretty low. And here's the thing though, we're also getting really good rates in certain lanes. Like I'm persistent, so we're finding lanes that are still, well over $2 a mile or over $2 a mile for our drivers. Sometimes they'll have to eat it coming out. Like, I had a driver that opted to deadhead out of Florida yesterday rather than take a load that would have at least paid fuel because he made his money going in. You know what I mean? Because I'm a hell of a dispatcher, so I found him a good load. We negotiated on a higher rate than what it was already paying, so you could afford to come out empty. To me, it would make more sense if he took a load coming out as well, even if it was just a pick and drop. Because, for example, he got empty around 10 o'clock yesterday, and then he deadheaded out of Florida. Didn't even arrive. He didn't get to the Georgia-Florida line until, well, I don't know, probably 5, 6 o'clock. He could have easily made another pickup and dropped it off in the same location. At least his fuel would have been covered. But he opted not to do that. He's an owner-op. He can make his own choices. And now he's sitting there, he's waiting for a money load for the weekend. Now, I mean, there's different things. Like, here's the thing that I think most carriers have to realize is in order to go out and run your own truck, if you're an owner-operator leased onto somebody else and you have the freedom to be able to book your own loads or work with a dispatcher that is helping you find loads, and you have to understand your cost to operate. You have to know that, okay, I need to make $1.78 all miles, or I need to make $2 all miles, or $2.50 all miles. Which means that no matter what, every single mile you travel, you need to make the certain amount to make sure you cover your financial responsibilities and all that, which you could do. Like, for example, say your cost is $2 a mile, right? And you know that all miles you need to make $2 a mile, so you're making money, so your truck payments are done, so the insurance is done, fuel is covered, all that stuff, right? And we're just ballparking a rate right now. If you get $3 a mile going into a location, you could still pull a load for $1 a mile coming out as a backhaul, because that still puts you at $2 a mile for all miles. A lot of people don't necessarily realize their cost to operate, and I think it's super important that every carrier out there, whether you're a truck driver, own your own MC, or whether you're leased onto somebody else, or you're doing one of these lease splits or whatever is going on in the freight industry. There's so many different scenarios that you must understand your cost to operate, because that is how you determine whether or not you're making any money. Like, I've seen some loads and they're moving, which is the craziest part. People are pulling loads for less than $1 a mile. So either their inbound freight is paying extremely well and they don't care and they're just worried about covering their fuel. But I can't imagine that that's the case on some of these loads because of where they're coming from or where they're going to, because I can reverse the inbound. So I can see the inbound lanes are only paying $1.70 and the outbound lanes are paying 90 cents or $1. There's no way you're making that $2 cutoff unless you have a direct shipper. That's another alternative. If you have a direct shipper that's shipping into that location and they're working on last year's rates or rates, over the past couple of years when they're a little bit higher, the contract rates. But then again, if you look at any of the broker forums, a lot of direct shippers are pulling their freight from the brokers, their contract freight, because they can get it cheaper on the spot. You know what I mean? So it's just really interesting. But for a long time, I've just maintained it's supply and demand. It's supply and demand, supply and demand. After calling on hundreds of loads yesterday, I literally came to the conclusion that it's not just supply and demand, that there are far more brokers out there that are charging an exorbitant or charging their customers what would be reasonable, right? Because every customer, and let me give some perspective from the freight broker industry that many people may not know. When I, as a freight broker, would go to quote a customer something, I'm using all of the metrics available. I'm using our past historical data. I'm using the DAT spot market rate. I'm using the DAT contract rate. I'm using Sonar if that's the route I go. I use truck stops rating tool. I use all of that data as aggregates to figure out where and what rate I'm going to charge my customer. Now, all brokers do it the same way in that regard. You're using historical rates, you're using current or future projected rates, using all of that and guesses essentially to figure out where you need to quote your customer so you can make a profit and you can successfully cover the load with a carrier, right? Ideally, I did it a little bit different because I also wanted the carrier to make some money because, again, happy carrier is like a happy life. It's like that happy wife, happy life, kind of the same thing with a happy carrier, that happier they are, the more often they're going to work with you. And so it's kind of interesting. But I don't know that I could quote customers at this spot market rate as low as some of these lanes are paying in order to book the load. I couldn't, and maybe it's just because of my background. Maybe it's because I was a trucker. Maybe it's because I owned a fleet of trucks. Maybe it's just because of my experience on the carrier side that I just couldn't do it because I understand the cost to operate for a truck. I'm not going to sell a load for $1 a mile to a carrier. It just doesn't make sense. Now, would I sell a load for $1.50 a mile or something like that to a carrier? Sure, because it could be a backhaul lane, and they may be generating enough revenue. But like I said, that load I called yesterday, that was 1,928 miles, paying with 2 stops, 2 drops, 1 pick, 2 drops, plus a 4-day transit, because it couldn't deliver the last stop until 4 days after it was picked up. I was thinking to myself, and I'm like, there's no way in heck that anybody's actually going to be able to pull this load, especially when you look at the destination area and what that outbound freight was paying. There's no way, and yet people are doing it. And I came to the conclusion yesterday that my belief that this is all supply and demand driven could potentially be wrong. that I think obviously that plays the biggest role is that if you have carriers that are going out and accepting cheap freight and going out and accepting these loads where it's like $2,800 on 2,500 miles, load posted right there that I just referenced, it doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? And if carriers are accepting those loads, they're doing a disservice because you're keeping the lane rates down in that market. You know what I mean? And how do you combat it? Because carriers also need to pay their bills. Carriers can't just sit and say, okay, I'm not hauling anything. You can't do it. You got your truck payments, you got your insurance payments, you got your payments, you got your livelihood payments. You can't just sit back and say, I'm not going to run. So how do you get to that equilibrium where rates start to come up? Freight Waves yesterday, it's all over Twitterverse or X now. A bunch of people at Freight Waves were sharing data maps and graphs from Sonar, which show that the tender volume has gone way down since pre-2019 levels. So really bad. And you start to see that too. I think fuel went down a couple of cents last night, or substantially. I don't know yet because it's still really early when I'm making this video. It's not live if you didn't know that. But the whole thing is just really... It's really perplexing because it's such an interesting job. You know what I mean? To dispatch trucks, it's such an exciting job because when you do book a good load, you're like, yeah, I got them. Got it. Did it. I did a good job. And when you're calling on loads all day long and then it's just nothing's working, or when you do find it and then you try to call your driver to convince him to take the load, and you go through your whole spiel about, hey, listen, this actually gets you to your goal. You just got to listen and figure out what I'm talking about. But it gets you to your cents per mile goal or your weekend revenue goal, or it does, but it's hard driving. I mean, that's the only way you're going to be able to do it. And it's pretty interesting. I mean, like this job... Even my wife is like, she's like, you're so much happier doing this back in the freight game. And I'm like, I truly am. I love it, and it's because every day is like a new challenge, So I don't know. It's just interesting, but we have to do something about the rates. And what I would say is the easiest way you guys, all the carriers that may watch this, the easiest way you guys can do something about the rates is simply, and it's super simple, simply figure out your cost to operate. And if you have a load that's your head haul, meaning it's not a back haul load, you have a head haul load, make sure you're getting enough revenue. Make sure you check the market where the load is going, check the outbound freight for that area, and make sure that you're going to be able to pull the difference in order to get to your cost per mile operator. For example, say you're picking up a load in Texas, right? And you want to go up to the Northeast, You check the loads coming from Texas to the Northeast. You see they're paying like $220, whatever, per mile. you then need to, before you book that load, you need to go to the Northeast because you don't have a direct customer up there. You don't have lines up there. You need to go to the Northeast and say, okay, are the outbound loads paying at least $1.30, $1.40, or $1.80 a mile or whatever to make it so you're at your $2 per mile goal? If they're not, then don't book that lane because you're going to end up losing money, or you're not going to end up making that goal that you set. Book a different lane where you could potentially make it. Say you find outbound freight, like Florida, for example. Florida is the best example I can give, right? Because inbound rate to Florida is paying anywhere from $2.50 to $3.50 or more per mile inbound with dry van freight right now. Coming out, you're lucky if you're getting $1 a mile, $1.20 a mile, $1.10 a mile coming out, but it's completely manageable, and you could be doing better than a lot of people in the market by running into Florida, dropping off your high value load, pulling, finding a dedicated route or something that's pulling, even if it's cheap, $1.20, $1.30, $1.40 a mile freight out of there, because it's going to keep your average where you need to be in order to profit. You know, like if I had my own company trucks, I'd bid on a lane going into Florida daily, and I'd bid at that $2.80, $2.90, $3 range coming in. And there's so many loads that are doing it. And then I would, bid on a lane that's coming out, that's making $1.20, $1.30, $1.40 if my, cost to operate sits right around $2 a mile. Fuel costs are super high. I mean, we're talking almost 70 cents per mile just for fuel right now. So then you add driver pay. If you're saying you're paying yourself 40 cents per mile, your cost to operate, your maintenance escrow, your everything, your insurance, you have to break that all down. I'm going to build a cost per mile calculator. We'll probably put one on the company website, but I'll also put one on freightbrokerlive.com. And so people can actually go in there and figure out what your cost per mile is. Because I think everybody needs to know. You at least need to know. It's one of the worst things when I call it a driver and I ask him, hey, all right, where do you want to go? He's like, I don't really know. I'm like, what's your cost per mile? And he's like, I haven't figured it out yet. I'm like, you should know that before you even lease onto a company. You should know that before you start your trucking company. You should know how much it costs you to run your truck and for you to profit. Because anything over that amount means you're making money. Anything under that amount means you're losing money. And including driver pay. You got to include yourself as a driver and that you're making money. It's really interesting that so many people don't. But it's the same thing. It's like people getting into dispatching trucks, right? That's why I hated the percentage-based dispatching. We tried really hard to float a flat rate dispatch, and the new program we're building and all that stuff is probably going to be a flat rate, because it's hard to calculate that on top of everything else when the markets are down. You can't charge 6 or 7 or 10% of the freight invoice when the carrier's not even making that profit. It's insane. But there's all different things. Like, I could go on about this for a very long time, and I think a lot of you guys would be like, what the hell? Because if you don't understand the market, it probably doesn't make any sense. But let's talk about some of the big news headlines of the day. Now, one of the big ones, which is something that I actually mentioned last week, is the total quality logistics thing. Or I mentioned it on Wednesday. I did mention that a lot of the big freight organizations, the freight media outlets, neglected to mention anything about this TQL lawsuit which came out on September 26th, a long time ago. So it's October 6th now. So anyway, a federal judge ruled against TQL in a massive class action lawsuit that could amount to millions, tens of millions of dollars having to be forked over to previous employees from TQL. Now, this all comes because apparently about 4,500 TQL employees between 2008 and 2016, I think, don't hold me to those dates, but they filed a class action lawsuit against TQL alleging that TQL hasn't been paying or wasn't paying them, overtime as they were due, requiring the employees to work 60 hours or more in order to book freight, but salarying them all at like 35, 37, 40,000 bucks a year. And then essentially after the probationary period of bringing on someone and having them generate a certain amount of revenue, if you didn't make that revenue, you lost your commission. And you lost your job, essentially. So a bunch of these employees all got together and did a class action lawsuit against TQL. Now, this lawsuit was initially filed in September, I think, of 2010, a long time ago. It was initially filed, and they kept it going for 13 years. TQL kept doing what they do and fighting with court and all that stuff. And ultimately, TQL lost. A federal judge decided that nope, TQL was responsible to pay every bit of overtime pay to all these former employees. But on top of that, they also ordered liquidated damages for every single employee too, up to the amount of back pay that they were owed. So, I mean, this could amount to $20,000 per employee, 20,000 times who knows, however many, 4,500. Once you add it all, and current employees that add on to the settlement, and then previous employees since then that didn't get overtime, some people, I think FreightWaves referenced a Twitter lawyer. I forgot what his name is. I do want to give him a shout out because I forgot who it is. Armchair attorney Matthew Leffler on Twitter said that it could be the beginning of the end of their business model. TQL argued that LAETS and junior LAEs, which are logistics agent trainees and logistics agent executives, were exempt from the movement or from the FLSA, so the overtime requirements, because they performed administrative duties. However, Leffler said that TQL failed to prove that their jobs were directly related to management of general business operations of TQL and its customers. These people had little independence over their ability to make a living, he said. He then goes on to say the question is what these people are actually doing. They are making cold calls. They are really out there prospecting to get business, and they're managing transportation to the extent from their mentor's book of business. The judge found that their duties are not directly related to the management or general business operations of TQL or TQL's customer. So this could be a huge lawsuit. It could be big. Oh, and the biggest thing about this whole case is it wasn't just TQL that was found liable. Their CEO, Ken Oakes, was also found liable for this damage, equally liable with TQL. So, and he's a very rich fella. And so it could directly impact their bottom line for a while. My guess is they're going to appeal it. And it's really weird because there's a lot of there's not a lot. There's one really abrasive. I think it's called the North American Owner-Operator Association, or NOOA. These guys, like, if you see them on Twitter or Facebook or what, they're completely batshit crazy. I'll be honest with you. This group is led by some guy that has no problem if you criticize them, he'll start cursing you out and swearing at you and block you and be like, "What the F are you following me?" and doing all that stuff. But weirdly, they were claiming like victory, like this is something they did. And, so I asked the question to their president. I said, "Hey, were you a TQL employee?" Because that would be a story, because he hates TQL and they're boycotting TQL and all that. And he's just like, "Why the F are you talking to me?" And like, very mature for a president of a trade organization that is out there to advocate for truckers. Anyway, but it's really interesting. And you can look them up on Facebook and Twitter, the NOOA. Just look up NOOA trucking and you'll see it. They're kind of, there's a little riff going on social media right now because they apparently charge all their members like $125 a year, and they promise to do all these services and all this stuff, and apparently they have a lot of members as well. And one of the things they advertise is the load board. They're all on that whole cheap freight argument all the time, so they're all criticizing cheap freight this, cheap freight that, cheap freight this. Well, it's funny because I'm in their group under one of my Facebook accounts, and I saw yesterday one of their members was complaining because their internal load board that's members only was a lumber. It was like a lumber mailing list that's uploaded every day. If any of you guys have never worked any lumber freight on the broker side, it is literally the bottom of the barrel freight. You can get it by just calling a lumber yard, and they'll send you their lumber list, and it's the cheapest freight. It's garbage. It sucks. It sucks to move. I've literally turned down lumber customers. We just don't work with them on the brokerage side in the past because there's no point. There's not enough profit to make a living and pay a carrier a decent wage. But they have all those loads on there, and this person made the mistake. This paying member of this association made the mistake of criticizing the load, saying it's cheap. It doesn't help me. It's cheap freight. And I just want anyone to know that's thinking about becoming a member, this board that they offer is cheap. It's worse than the load boards. So he went on a banning spree. I tweeted about it last night, but the president, the Michael guy, went nuts again. He banned like 20 people, and he's like, anyone wants to F with me, F this, F that, F this, and just went on a big tangent, which is, to me, it's just really amusing because if that's the way you're going to run your trade organization, that's fine. Plus, look who they partnered with. Like they partnered with another guy that has a trucking trade association that is claims 10,000s of members, tens of thousands of members. This guy literally ran a group or a company that was fined by the FTC for millions of dollars for defrauding small owner operators, allegedly. and they're all working together to start this big non-profit. I don't even know if it's a non-profit. I don't know. To start this company that is doing the same thing OIDA does. They're saying they're lobbying. I don't think they actually are. But they're setting up insurance plans, factoring plans, private load boards, all of which you got to pay for, that are just doing the same exact thing everybody else is doing. Like, if they started with the initial concept of actually trying to help the freight industry, I would get it. At that point, that would make sense. Like, if they actually maintain that, and here's a word to the wise, the Michael guy, you're probably not watching this, but if you are, you obviously are you're probably like me, except I can control myself a little bit better than you can, apparently. But you shouldn't be the president of the organization. Become a chairman or something like that, where you're not public facing. If you're going to sit there and go after everybody and curse at people and do this and that, you're literally going to turn people away that would potentially become members. Appoint someone, a public-facing person that could go out there, and not someone like the other guy that runs a trade organization that was fined by the FTC for defrauding owner-operators, because anybody that's worked in the industry for a long time, I don't even need to say his name, because everybody knows who he is. He's been around for a very long time doing the same freaking thing. And hire someone else. Hire someone. You're making enough in your dues, apparently. Hire someone to run it. Because if it's truly a nonprofit, you as the president shouldn't be making any money off of a nonprofit. Not even drawing a salary. That's my belief. Like, if you're running a nonprofit or a 504c1 or whatever the hell it is, an advocacy group, you should not be making a profit. Go out and truck. I know that he says the trucking company shut down, probably because of cheap rates. But I don't know. I just thought it was kind of like funny that the guy is running a load board on his board, or 4 members, while he always publicly complains about cheap freight. That's literally offering cheap freight to his drivers. It's insane. But we do in the transportation industry need some organization to rival OIDA. And here's the thing. OIDA, great concept. I don't think they do enough to go out and rep for the independent owner ops. I think they created an insurance product. That's where they make the majority of their revenue. They go out and lobby, but if you pay attention, most of the government stuff that happens that involves the trucking industry, OIDA is often really late at putting out a statement or late to the table. I remember when Donald Trump was president, there was something going on where Donald Trump created like a COVID board to deal with transportation, right? And they had a bunch of people, TIA was on it, everybody was on it, and I remember being so mad that the OOIDA missed the boat, did not get in time, and then they put out a press release saying they were really mad that they weren't invited. The thing about Washington is everybody talks. You know if they're setting up a board or something before, so you could argue that OOIDA's lobbyists weren't good enough to pay attention to what was going on in time to get a seat on the board so they could actually lobby for small trucking. I have a hard time believing that people are advocating for the trucking industry in a positive light if what they're doing all the time is selling services. Do you know what I mean? Like, there was another organization, and I won't mention it, but there was another organization that recently contacted me and wanted me to be a part of, and I'm not quite sure what they wanted me to do, but they wanted me to, sorry, I'm just checking on those real quick. They wanted me to, speak about their association and all that stuff. And I went through, I went through a phone conversation with a guy who's definitely a salesman, very good salesman. But I've been in the industry for so long. I've seen so many things over the past 17 years. I asked a couple of questions. I asked about the fact that they're packaging offerings and cards and this and that to drivers. And then I asked if they're for-profit or non-profit. And they said, no, they're for-profit. And I said, nah, I don't want anything to do with it at that point. If it was a non-profit, possibly. But it's a for-profit company. That's what it is. It's a company. So, companies say whatever they can to get people to buy their shit. You know what I mean? And we don't need that. We need a good, strong nonprofit, a good, strong, lobbying organization for everyone in transportation, not just small trucking, small brokers, everybody, to get some unified front. Can you imagine if they called a big conference and they had brokers and carriers and referees and like security to keep them apart, and they got to sit down and actually talk about the industry from a perspective that is not often seen, where carriers are, talking to brokers and brokers are talking to carriers and showing rate cons and talking about different things. Because a lot of carriers think brokers are making an arm and a leg. A lot of brokers think carriers are, I don't know what brokers think about carriers. Because I had a different way of thinking about it than some of these guys, apparently, some of the brokers out there. Because, again, I would never sell, a load that's paying 90 cents a mile to a driver. I just wouldn't do it. Unless it was a partial or something like that. But a full truckload, 44,000 pounds with 2 stops, get the hell out of here. I'm never going to forget about that load. I'll be talking about it every day probably for the next 3 years. Because, it's like I was telling my boss. It's hard for me sometimes because you guys know how I am from the videos. It's hard for me to sometimes take a step back, to stop, to mellow out, and to think before I speak. But I did good. I did good yesterday because, again, I'm an employee now. It's different than what I've done before. So I have to also act with the best interests of my employer. So rather than do what I wanted to do was be like, you offered me how much bleeping bleep beep 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 beep. Yeah, I was just like, yeah, that rate's not going to work, and hung up the phone, and then did it all. I should have recorded the call, because that would have been mildly entertaining, because my reaction after, I literally got up and stormed out. I was so pissed off. I'm like, what the hell? And then I ran the lanes and all that stuff, and there's again, no way to dictate, a rate that low. And I've already talked about it, so I'm not going to do it again. But, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in the freight industry. But anyway, that's your first segment of this. What's going on, everybody? I wanted to circle back to the rate thing because I just had a revelation. It's not really a revelation, to be honest. But, so it's I make these videos throughout the working day. So I'm looking at all these different loads that are posting up. And I just called, 4 or 5 of them back to back to back, right? As the loads posted, immediately called them. And while they were waiting and, looking up the information, I quickly quoted the spot per the mile like that. And literally the spot rate on that, I quoted that, multiplied the miles. And by the time they gave me their rates, I realized there's one thing for all the loads, because I was trying to get one that had at least 1,200 miles. For every load that I called, they were roughly $300 to $500 under the spot rate. So, for example, the spot rate on the last one I called was 1,954 miles. The spot rate average, so at $1.79 per mile, that would put me at $34.97.66. When the woman finally got back to me, she's like, okay, we're paying $3,050. And I said, in order for me to call my driver, I need at least $34.97.66. And she's like, you're way off. And I said, I didn't say that, but I wanted to be like, no, actually you're way off, because I know what they're doing, or at least it's what I predict they're doing. They are quoting the spot market to their customers and then selling that rate and then having to sell a lower rate to the carriers, at least on this spot freight. Because a lot of times what people do is, brokers in the morning, they'll get an email from their customer, and the customer will say, hey, I've got one load going from Valdosta, Georgia to Pompton Lakes, New Jersey, right? And they'll say, oh, it's roughly 800 miles. Well, they don't even say the mileage. They'll, a quote from a customer to a broker will be this. I've got a load ready today, picking up from us, going to Pompton Lakes, New Jersey. It's 4,400 pounds. Give me a rate. The broker isn't going to take the time to figure out what they're previously, in theory, a lot of the big brokers have software that they use. So they'll, in our system has it as well, I believe it does. Most systems have it where you can just punch in the origin and destination zip codes, and it'll pull the rate, and it will use, depending on how you train it, it'll use historical rate, it'll use this, it'll use that, it'll pull all of that information in and give you a rate. What I suspect a lot of brokers are doing, and this is more of the smaller brokers, not like the TQLs and all that stuff. They have different pricing models that they use. They're probably giving a more accurate rate based on the sheer amount of volume that they could move to move the freight for the least amount of money that it's going to cost them, where they're going to make the most amount of profit, because they have all of that data. I would be interested to see if they share any of their data with Sonar, or even if they're one of the companies that shares their information with DAT. That would be relatively interesting to me. If DAT was like, oh, TQL, you guys don't need to pay for a user seat. We'll give you the load board access for free. We just want all your data. I wonder if they do that. because that would be smart. And that would also directly, I wonder where they get their data. Now I want to know. Does anybody know? How about you comment below if you're watching this on YouTube? What carrier, because I think I read an article once that said that gets their information from carriers and brokers, and that's where they're using to come to their conclusion on the spot market. That's where they use to calculate it. That's interesting. I never really thought about it. Someone that commented yesterday and said, do you keep your monitors way up high? So I've actually got a big monitor right here, a big 30, I think it's like a 39-inch curve monitor. And then I have two other monitors up top. So I have the DAT load board here, which is always refreshing. That's why I keep looking at it. Because again, I am actively working while I make these videos. And then on the other screen, I have the software that we're using, the broker carrier software that we use, which I'm not a huge fan. But it's a great software. It does what it's supposed to. I just don't I like things to be prettier. I know, it sounded weird. See, there's some loads that, like, if I ran the truck, like if it was my truck under forced dispatch, I would accept these loads quick as shit. Because I see so many of them that I'm like, okay, we can make money, we could drop tomorrow. But it's different when you dispatch for an owner-op because he has the full rate. Plus, he didn't answer the phone when I just called him on a different load. But he dictates where he wants to go, and I know what he wants to do. He wants to make a boatload of money over the weekend. But I'm going to do my damnedest to try. Hopefully, because I built him a big-ass, like, multi-lane, multi-drop thing for the weekend, presented it to him, and he's like, nah. And I'm like, what? It was $2 a mile, all miles, and he still said no. And I was like, damn it, bro. But again, that's the beauty of this company, is this company, the owner-ops, they dictate their future. That, like, the owner-ops can go on the boards themselves, they can book their own loads, they can do everything. That's why, like, if you are looking for a new home for your truck, you really should consider coming over to TRC Freight. Go to trcnme.com. You can fill out your application right there. They do an 88-12 split, so you keep 88% of the load, plus all fuel if the fuel is separate. And the deductions are pretty cheap. Insurance, I think deductions, including insurance, trailers, escrow, ELD, and all that stuff is right around $600 a week. Which is pretty darn cheap when you compare it. And if you run power only or you have your own trailer, then you can do that as well. But it's interesting because we don't charge for the dispatch. What we do is we're like we work for you. You know what I mean? Which is kind of interesting. It's a different concept because a lot of companies that do the split the way they do, they charge for the dispatching. We don't. And we basically, like, for example, say if one of my drivers books his own load, we do all the paperwork for him. He just sends it and says, Steve, I got this load. This is it. Take this load, and so we do it all. That's what we do. But it's an interesting little thing. So if you are looking for a new home, you should come over here. Man, some of these loads too, like Texas. I mean, they're not even trying to quote at spot on some. And that's why I came to the solution that I bet a lot of these brokers, especially these smaller guys, that they're quoting spot to their customer and then trying to sell under spot, which is not the way you do it. You should do spot plus 10%, spot plus 12%, spot plus 20%, whatever your profit margin is, because then you're going to cover the load a lot quicker. You're not going to have to work at it. For example, like a load from Lake Park, Georgia to Sequin, Texas just popped up. 958 miles. Let's do some math here. It's 958 miles. Clear this. 958 miles, and they're paying $1,300. So let's divide that by 13. I did it wrong. I got to do it the other way. 1,300 divided by 958 miles. That's $1.35 per mile. So that's 20 cents under the spot. So that's $1.35. You want to round it up, $1.36 per mile, which is 20 cents per mile under the spot. So let's do some quick math. If you're doing 958 times 0.2, let's just say 20, that's $200 profit. $200 profit on that. See, that's 20. That's about. So what's? Figure. I'm not going to do that. But so they're probably working at what, 15, 18% profit? I guarantee that's what they're doing. I never quoted that way. Where you quote off the spot. Never did it. I always would base, if I did quote off the spot, I would quote like $1.55, like, right? So this lane, according to DAT, ranges between $1.39 and $1.69. I would either use the average, which is $1.55, or I'd use $1.65. And what I would have done is did $1.69 times 958, 1619. It would have been my bill to my customer. And I always did that. I would do 1619. I wouldn't round up to 1650 or round down to 16. I always did 1619.02. Because I'm very particular about it. And I feel like when you present that to a customer, the customer's like, that's the rate. You know what I mean? It's just, and that's why I've had good success booking freight. But that was, what was it? 1619. 1619. Whoa. But that was 1619. There's something for all the politics viewers that watch. You all know what I just did. But I don't talk about politics anymore unless it involves the freight industry. So 1619, and let's say, and this load's paying, so that's a $319 profit, which puts it at, that's about, what, 20? Yeah, that's about 20% again. And I guarantee that's what they're doing. They're selling it. Man, I wonder if that's just like education for these guys, that it's cheaper to just quote off of the spot, sell the spot rate to your customer. Or maybe they are quoting the same way. But if you did... Yeah, I don't know. It's very odd. Very odd to me. But I know that was just a random little video in the middle of this video. But it's because we were talking about rates before. And then I was calling on all these rates and finding out what they were paying. And I was like, wait a second. I think that's what they're doing, is they're quoting the spot to their customer and not adding a profit margin on. And then taking their profit off of the spot quote, which is why rates are running several $100s below spot right now. Because normally they would stick pretty close to spot, right? And they'd be covered really, really fast. You know, and a lot of times what you can do is you can quote at spot. Like, for example, say that load was 1619 or whatever. Say you quote at spot. Actually, you wouldn't quote it, because that would be, say you do $1.55 times 958. That would be $14.84. They're offering 30 or 1,300. Which would be like 15%. But I would take this and then add my percentage. So I would do 1484.90 times that by, say I wanted to make 15%. So that'd be $222 plus 1489, which, you know, do the math. Which would be the 16, right around 16. Oh, so it's right around the same amount. I don't know. It's just interesting. It's interesting when you do it. Because again, I'm an analytical thinker, so I try to figure out what everyone else is doing and how much these brokers are charging their customer for the particular lane. And that's just because I'm a broker, so that's typically what I would do if I was going after a new client and I know what their freight rates are, or especially because a lot of times if you're a volume guy or a volume broker, you can go after a client and say, hey, listen, send me a list of your, the loads that you moved in the previous 100 days so I can look at those rates and show you how I can save money. They will then send you an Excel spreadsheet, which will have all of their origins, all of their destinations, the weight, all of the information plus the rate they paid. And then basically you tweak it, you find their cent per mile, you compare it against the DAT, and then you say, okay, I'm going to undercut these rates by this amount. And that's how you do. That's a really simple version of how you can quote and get, direct customer freight. But again, you got to be able to service the lane. If you can't service the lane, or say you only have one truck or something like that, you can't service a lane that has 500 shipments a day, or 500 shipments a week or a year. You can't do it if you only have one truck. So that's one of the advantages of leasing on. Like if you're someone that is running your own small company, but you're struggling to find customer freight because you are going out knocking on doors and saying, hey, I'm Joe Blow's Trucking, and they're like, all right, we'd love to work with the local guys. How many loads can you handle a week? And you're like, well, I can only handle one. And they're like, well, we can't do that. And a lot of you guys that have been trucking for a long time, that there are customers like that you just miss the opportunity because you don't have enough trucks. That is why it's a good idea to partner with us, because not only could we handle all of that, it's your account. We could probably set you up, like say you have an account, right? Like I would have to check with the owners, but say you have an account, right? You're running under your small trucking company. Your insurance is going higher and higher every single month because all these boneheads are entering in the business and then leaving and not paying their bills and all that. Say you have a couple of direct customers, you're in here, you want to handle more business, we could probably lease you on and then give you a sales agent commission for every load that doesn't move on your truck from your customer. I guarantee I could sell them on that. So anyone that's interested in that, you can comment below or send me an email to live@freightbrokerlive.com. Live@freightbrokerlive.com. Because we'll figure it out. I mean, if any of you guys are struggling to figure out your business or anything like that, like, I'll do my best to help you, whether it's, bringing you on here or whether it's just doing consulting stuff or building a platform, we're already doing that. We're building a platform that will help you, guaranteed. But yeah, there's a lot of cool things in the future. I'm just trying to be silent about it. This show so far is pretty much like the old Freight Broker Live shows where I just rant about the industry nonstop. It's pretty good so far, huh? You guys enjoying yourselves? Comment below, as the YouTube kids say. Well, so now most of the day has passed, right? Well, you guys probably don't know. It's actually just after lunchtime. I just had some rice, so I could keep getting big, right? So I just ate some rice. We booked the one truck that was sitting down in Georgia, so I'm happy about that. He's now going to be running. He's got a hike to do, so that should be good. And I'm trying to figure out, what it is that we're going to talk about now for the rest of the show, right? Because none of you guys left any comments in the comment section of the YouTube video, which I'm going to link first in the description of this video on every platform, excluding YouTube. So that way, if you have a comment about the freight industry that you want me to talk about, whether it's about broker transparency, which I think I already covered here. Oh, you know what? Maybe I didn't. So maybe I'll try to explain that. Because earlier today, I saw some twits about some of the. I talked about it a little bit previously. Let me explain what this freight broker transparency argument is, right? Now, there are regulations in place right now. I think it's like 343, blah, 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 which says that a carrier, any party of a freight transaction, has a right to review said transaction after the load is completed. So a lot of the argument that I'm hearing it won't affect the rate for the load that you're doing because you wouldn't be entitled to see the rate that the broker is that the broker is making or the broker is charging the shipper. You're not going to see that rate until after the transaction is completed. Now, you won't be able to share that transaction because any broker that has a problem with transparency, if they were forced to have that problem with transparency publicly, they would probably make you sign an NDA in order to see that rate, because there's nothing that says that would have to go through the whole court system. If a broker put you on an NDA and said you're not allowed to disclose any proprietary information, their rate is proprietary information, because me as a freight broker could go after other freight brokers. Let's say this. Say there was a database of freight transaction rates because one carrier is booking loads with all sorts of brokers, if transparency was a real thing, and then posting the rates that the shipper was paying the broker on some sort of social media platform or some platform online, and then having that information accessible to everyone else, right? So that would be a conflict, and no broker is going to agree. And I got a big belief that this is one of the major pushbacks against the freight broker transparency thing, because in all reality, it doesn't matter how much a freight broker is making in correlation to how much a carrier is making, because the carrier is the one that dictates how much they make. You know what I mean? It's not, carriers aren't going in throwing up their hands in surrender under the threat of death that they need to take the load, because that's simply not how it's working. What's actually happening is brokers are selling cheap freight to carriers, and carriers are accepting that cheap freight and hauling it and then complaining about it later because they didn't get more money. Well, here's the thing. If you don't accept that cheap freight, chances are, especially like if you book in the morning, you're going to get a more expensive load. Perfect case in point. I booked a load from Georgia to Washington, right? Earlier today. We booked a load for the driver. I did not book the first, second, third, fifth, 10th, 20th load that fit what my driver was looking for. What I did is I waited until we found a load that fit the financial requirements of said driver. And that's because in all reality, the load that I called on and negotiated up to a higher rate, that load was initially posted around 8 o'clock this morning at a much lower rate. And every hour that transpired, the broker tacked a little bit more money. And then when I finally called on the load, I ended up getting quite a bit more money than what was originally posted, because that's the way the freight industry works. If I didn't get the rate that I wanted, we wouldn't have accepted a load. Here's another example for another driver. We bid on a load through a bidding platform. Worked out to be $268 a mile. And I remember it because I was like, this is a good load if it does go. $268 a mile. Now, that was actually the spot average for that particular lane. We lost that bid because someone undercutted the bid and bid out. It was like $3,100 and change is what they bid. Ours was like $34. So the driver was like, dude, we should rebid on this. And I'm like, no. For one, you're setting a low precedent for yourself because you're bidding lower than what you need to. And secondly, the load doesn't even pick up today. It doesn't even pick up tomorrow or Sunday or Monday. It picks up on Tuesday. So if they're trying, from the perspective of a broker, if a broker is trying to secure a truck 4 or 5 days in advance, there's two things that could happen, or three. One, the load goes off without a hitch. Everyone's happy. Two, the broker cancels because the shipper is not ready to ship. Or three, the carrier ends up taking a load that's more, money or something, and then canceling that relationship. All of those don't really work, And then what if you add transparency into that argument too? I think what people believe, this whole freight transparency thing, I think what they believe is that the entire freight transaction will be available for them to see prior to accepting the transaction, which is not the way it's written in the regulations. The way it's written in the regulations is all parties would have a right to see, once the load is completed, the freight transaction and all the financials associated with it. So you would see what the shipper pays the broker, you'd see what the broker pays the carrier, and everybody would be, the wiser on what people are paying. It doesn't stop the carrier from hauling the load because the carrier already has to haul the load. The only thing it does is it says, oh, so Joe Schmo's carrier, booked the load with A and B broker and didn't get that much. The broker made more, right? Or whatever. But another carrier that has a lower cost of operating then goes to Joe Blow's brokerage and says, hey, I can do the load cheaper than the last carrier, and I know how much you paid him because of this freight rate transparency. Wow, that's like a tongue twister for me. It's just, the whole argument is just dumb, and I don't know why anybody says it. You keep hearing, like I saw, I don't want to call him a grifter in chief, just a not a good person, just in general. If you've been fined by the FTC for defrauding owner-operators, you're probably not a good person. But I saw this person post on Twitter talking about how, for everyone that's arguing about freight transparency, it's like saying that broker or real estate brokers shouldn't have a commission that's set and fully transparent. It's not the same transaction. You know why? For one, you're not moving a $250,000 house or $1 million home. And secondly, it's a whole different regulation system. So are what they advocating for is on a state individualized level to have every freight contract be public? Do they want the cost to shipping costs to be public? Do they want no competition? Are they not capitalist? You would think that they would be capitalist, seeing how they were fined millions of dollars for defrauding owner-operators because of their capitalistic ventures of said violating owner-operators' trust and safety. But I don't know. The whole thing is stupid. And the freight transparency argument, although it's good on its face because what it hopes, I guess the threat of transparency would be that the carrier won't work for the broker anymore. But what the carriers don't realize is that there are a million other individual brokers out there that would do it. It's really weird. What's going on, everybody? I decided the next thing I'm going to talk about today is this whole transparency issue, right? Normally, on this YouTube video and every other YouTube video, if you have something you want me to address, you can leave a comment on the main YouTube page. It's at Steve Oatley YT. on YouTube, you can go to that main, find this video, leave a comment, and then that'll be what I talk about tomorrow. Or on the next episode of Freight Broker Live, which is Monday night. That one will likely be live because I'll be in Chattanooga. Anyway, so I want to talk about this freight transparency issue. I talked about it a little bit before with some of these associations that are supposedly working for the benefit of the small carrier. But let's talk about what the argument is, right? So there's this archaic regulation that's currently in place, which basically says anybody that is a party to a freight transaction has a right to review that transaction in all of its records in full, including freight invoices, at the time after the load has been completed. You have a right to see the transaction, which means that a carrier has the right to see how much the broker was paid by the shipper. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't solve the issue of low rates or anything, because everyone's arguing freight transparency as if it's going to solve whether or not you accept a load beforehand. It doesn't. And you want a case in point on that? Look at UShip. When UShip first came out, they're an online freight matching platform. When they first came out, the shippers post the rate where they want to pay to get stuff moved. Carriers and brokers then would go bid on that load. And what they do is they underbid it lower and lower and lower and lower and lower until the shipper finally accepts the load that is far less than what they first wanted to get shipped, because the carriers and brokers all bid against each other, driving the rate lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. And so just on that premise, the whole system doesn't work. Let's take another example, right? Say you're a broker. Say I'm a broker and there's another big broker right there that has a load and has a customer. They ended up giving a load to a broker. They gave that load to a carrier. That carrier's pissed off because they feel like they got shortchanged on it. They demand freight transparency, right? So they look at the rate. They're pissed off that the broker made 20% profit on it and they didn't. And so they got really mad and they post all that information online, right? And I, as another broker, now have a full transaction of someone else's record. And just in case you didn't know, there's this thing called freight bill auditing, which happens a lot in LTL, but it happens in full truckload too. It's basically, and it's a sales tool, right? And I basically will demand, or I talked about it earlier today, if I'm approaching a new customer and they have a contract lane or they have a ton of freight, what I will do is I'll go to the customer and I'll say, hey, listen, you ship a lot. I want to be able to beat your pricing, to look at it competitively. What I would like is a spreadsheet of the previous 90 days of freight bills. So every shipment you've shipped in the past 90 days, tell me where it went to, where it picked up from, tell me how much it paid and what the weight was. And they put it on a big spreadsheet, and then I do all my magic on it to figure out how much I need to charge to undercut the freight rates that they're currently being paid. And then I send my proposal in. That's how contract awards are usually given. There's a lot of other things that go into it. But that's another incident. Now imagine I already know now how much the broker made, or the broker was charging the shipper to move a load because some pissed off carrier posted that information online. I then cancel out that business. I end up paying the carrier cheaper in the long run, and get the load from the shipper because I've undercut all the brokers because that information is around. Now you could combat this, right? Because that is a threat, or the threat that at least a lot of people on the broker side are making about transparency. You can combat this by requiring that the carrier sign an NDA, or viewing in person in like a lockbox where they're not allowed to bring phones or any video or any pictures, and they can come in and look at your transactions, and they have to sign an NDA saying that they're never going to share that information with anybody else. And maybe that's what brokers should do. They should say, yes, if you want to see the rate, you have to schedule an appointment with me. You insert it, you come into the building. You have to go through strip search security. You have to then turn in your phone, turn in your computer, turn in any device, change into a white scientific, one of those white scientific uniforms, right? Where it keeps all the germs out. You have to change into that so we assure that you have no camera equipment. You can then go in and review your rate, and then you leave. In all reality, they're considered trade secrets. Wouldn't you agree that a rate that a broker is charging a customer to be a trade secret? Because I certainly would. Because again, as a broker, if I know what rate another broker is charging a carrier, all I have to do is undercut that rate, and then I get the business. The free transparency argument is silly, because not a lot of people understand the actual market. If you understand, like for when I look at these rates here, I can estimate how much the broker is paying is charging the customer, because I've been a broker for years. So I can estimate what it is based on what I would charge. Okay, and then add a little bit because I didn't charge the carrier, or I didn't charge customers as much as most of these other brokers, which is why I was so busy. But I can do that because I have the experience. An independent owner operator doesn't necessarily have that experience. He doesn't know what the broker is charging, and so it's all left to speculation. So when the rates go down and the market tanks and everybody's freaking out because they're not making enough money, it's easy to assume that it's the shipper or the broker that is making a tremendous amount of profit. Okay, and even in my concession yesterday and earlier today in this video, I've said that I no longer believe it's just supply and demand, right? Because I do believe there are brokers that are selling rates that are either one, they're making more money than what they normally would in terms of a commission. They're making way more than 10 or 20%, or they are not quoting their customers accurately, and then it's reflecting on the rate to the carrier. I don't know which one it is, but when you sell a full truckload of 44,000 pounds for 89 cents a mile, I can't imagine anybody actually quoting that and making sense of it. You know what I mean? Like, to me, there's no way you could ever move that load, and let alone quote it to your customer, unless you're trying to make a boatload of money. You know what I mean? And that was the realization I had yesterday with looking at all these rates. But again, even in that scenario, how does freight transparency help you? Because you're only a party to the transaction after you're a party to the transaction. You only have the right to review those records after the transaction's been completed. So that means after the money has been sent, after the broker's been paid, after the load is delivered, after you've invoiced the broker, and after the broker has invoiced you, and after the shipper has paid the broker, at that point, that is when you would be allowed to see the documents based on the regulations that are currently in place. So obviously they're quite flawed and they don't work the way they're supposed to. So what do you do to actually fix the issue? I think what a lot of these people, which is weird because they seemingly are on the right and don't believe in big government and don't want the ELDs and don't want increased government regulation, but yet they're asking for more government regulation to enforce transparency, which doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. Because in all reality, if all information was public, you know what that is? It's not competition. All small owner ops would be done. Imagine if you're a small carrier, right? You have a shipper. You have a little contract with that shipper, and you're paying $1.25 getting paid $1.50 a mile, or $3 or $4 a mile, and it's every week, and it's a shipment. It's your lifeblood. You could do it all. Well, now all freight transactions are perfectly made public. That shipper is now going to see that JB Hunt or one of these other companies can move that load cheaper than what you can. And so now what they're going to do is they're going to go to them. Why? Because it's cost savings for the business. Why wouldn't they do it? Oh, you would say, well, they wouldn't do that because our service, blah, blah, blah. There's a million other companies that will provide an adequate level of service that can undercut your rate. Just for example, like us, we have more trucks than a solo operator. We can go out and bid lower than a carrier could that only has one truck. Because we could eat the loss and make it up on other losses. That's what you do as a freight broker too. You know, this one load where you think a freight broker may be making 50, 20%, profits, that in all reality, they could be losing their ass because they made all their money on other loads and this one was a hard sell. There's all different scenarios. So I think what a lot of people need to do is you got to figure out your cost to operate first, and that's crucial. And I'm going to hit it every single day. Carriers need to figure out their cost to operate. If you don't figure out your cost to operate, then how can you dictate whether or not someone else is making more money than you? Because you don't even know how much you're actually making. You know what I'm saying? And then once you get to that point, then you have to say, okay, you have to come to the conclusion and say, I'm no longer going to accept any loads that do not meet that cost to operate, that minimum rate per mile that I need in order to stay afloat. Once you get to that point, guess what happens? If you start refusing loads and everybody else does it because everyone woke up all of a sudden realized that they do control the market and they all stop accepting loads. Say you got 50 trucks in a market, right? All 50 trucks say, well, I'm not taking that load unless it pays $3 a mile. Do you know what the broker is going to do? Do you think they're going to give back the load to the shipper? No, they're going to pay the carrier the closest to $3 a mile that they can get. That's just what's going to happen. If they're offering a load for $1 and every single carrier says no, they have to come up on the rate. That is the way it happens. And so it's funny to me that people will be like, oh, we need to shut down our trucks to protest cheap freight. How does that do anything? Especially on the small level, you're not shutting down your trucks to protest cheap freight. Because in all reality, the carriers that can operate are doing it. What I'm saying is that in order to actually affect a change in this low rate market, the only way to do it is to either one, be unified across every single trucking company in America all at once, where everyone decides, hey, every load must be $2 per mile or whatever, or $3. But then again, how can you do that? A big trucking company may have an operating cost of $1.78. Even though the ATRI, or the ATA's research arm, ATRI, says that the average cost is $2.34, I think is what they say it is now. But how can you justify, if the average cost to own a truck and operate it with the driver and insurance and all the tags, tolls, all that stuff is $2.38 per mile, according to the research arm of the Trucking Association, American Trucking Association. What if you're a little guy, that needs, you got a $1,700 a month truck payment, you got a $2,000 a month insurance payment, you got a fuel bill that's $3 or $4 or $5 a month, you got all this stuff. Your cost to operate is quite a bit. It's substantially higher than what the megacorps are. But now you all have to compete at the same rate. Are you saying that the mega corporations should add more trucks because they're making more money because we have a universal rate across the board? That's the whole reason why this whole freight transparency argument doesn't work. And I don't understand why people believe that it will. And I don't know if I said it because I'm talking really quick, but I'll do it again. There was a conversation that's being had on social media about people complaining about freight transparency and saying, for anyone that doesn't believe it works, blah, 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 explain why real estate brokers have fees that are public before the transaction is completed. It's a completely different industry. Are you asking for more regulations? All those companies, the James Lambs of the world, are they asking for more government regulations? Which is really weird, because you're asking the government to not regulate trucking as much while asking government to regulate trucking as much. You know what I mean? And I know what I just said. It's very confusing because they ask government not to over-regulate with ELDs and hours of service and DOT compliance and all this stuff, but then they want the government to regulate. You can't pick and choose what the government wants or what is going to regulate. Unless you're part of the government, and then you just make up, flip of a coin. You're just like, okay, we'll do this today. I don't know. I think people really need to take a step back. If you're arguing the freight transparency argument, actually look into the freight industry. Go spend some time working as a freight broker, okay? Do that. Spend some time trying to sell loads to carriers and understand that, well, one carrier may hold firm and say, I'm not going to do it. There's 17 other carriers behind them that are like, give me that shit. I could do it. Why? Because it's a backhaul for them. It's not a head haul. Maybe a head haul for you, but it's a backhaul for them. So they can do it for $1 a mile or $1.50 a mile or $2 a mile, whereas you can't. You need more money. Are they a bad carrier because they plan better than you? Like, I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious what people have to say about that. So I would like everybody, if you're watching this and you are actively involved in the freight industry, type a comment down below on the YouTube page. Type a comment. And let me know what you believe. Do you believe that freight brokers are all greedy pieces of garbage that are taking way too much profit? Do you believe that the whole entire freight transaction should be made available? Why stop with just the carrier? Why not stop with everybody else? Why not just make all freight transactions completely positive, or public, right? So there's no competition anymore. You don't want competition, right? So all carriers charge the same amount, all brokers charge the same amount, all shippers get pay the same amount. Everything's universal. It takes out competition. But then what do you have? You have to go further. Okay, if manufacturer of cell phones has this freight rate and manufacturer of cell phones, another one, has the same freight rate, how do you determine which product you buy? Because now their freight rates are the same. They can't charge more than each other because we must regulate that as well. Why stop with just a freight transaction? Why not charge or, make sure there's transparency in the manufacturing transaction and the retail transaction and everything else? Why not just do that? I don't know. It would go bad. That's the only thing I could say. It would go bad. Okay, so I think people need to start thinking about freight transparency and what it really means before you do that. Now, do I think there's a place in this country for a simple flat fee or something for a shipper and the rate is completely transparent and open for carriers to move freight? Yes, absolutely. I do. And I think we'll have one eventually. Where that portion of the transaction is acceptable and public, but how much the carrier charges, that won't be. Do you know why? Because the carriers, you need competition. Again, one carrier can do a load for $1,000. Well, one carrier may need 1,200 or 5,000 or whatever in order to do that lane. It all depends on their cost to operate. Should we open up the transaction and break down how much a carrier is making to do a load? Because then we can determine whether or not he's made too much because some other carrier says he can do it less. Because that's essentially what they're saying from the broker perspective. Should brokers require carriers to open their books? The whole transparency argument's stupid. Because I just don't believe in big government. I believe in less government. And if you try to enforce transparency, you're asking for huge government and huge government overreaches, and it will never happen. So maybe they should focus on how they can unify and educate all these new truck drivers that are entering the industry and have no knowledge of the industry in order to be successful. The knowledge required in order to be successful. I don't know, but I have a meeting now. That's why you heard all the bells and whistles. So I got to go to do that meeting. I'll be back. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Freight Broker Live. I actually forgot that I never finished this, and I just got back from the gym, and I was like, oh no. So tonight's episode is not going to be live, obviously. Mondays will be live, so make sure you tune in 8 o'clock. Hopefully this has been helpful to all of you guys in the freight industry. Make sure you check out our show sponsor, trcandme.com. trcandme.com. If you're looking for a new home for your trucking company, visit trcandme.com. All right, guys, I will see all of you on Monday night.